Welcome to another episode of The Aligned Life, The Goddess Life, where we dive into living life fully aligned, mind, body, and spirit, at peace and unbothered. We are here for another episode of our Trauma Talk where Ashley and I sit down and we're going to dive into some of the energetic themes that are surrounding this particular time, how they'll show up for us, and how we can move through, transmute, and invite new energies into our space. Good morning, Ashley. How have you been? This has been an interesting week energetically. How are you holding up?
Well, I'm finally defrosting.
Oh yeah, because you had all of the snow in a place that doesn't get snowy. I think we talked about that last week.
Yeah, we were preparing last week. I think it was Monday actually, because um, we had to delay the podcast recording for last week.
Yeah.
Yeah, Monday night is we got about roughly 4 to 6 inches, just depending on the drift that you measure.
Oh my goodness.
I
That's a
still have
lot
a
for
giant
you
snowball
guys
that my
though.
Yeah, I still have a giant snowball in my front yard from my daughter's attempt to build a snowman.
Oh, that's always fun.
Yeah, it's just out of place. Bright, sunny blue skies, random snowball.
Well, that's kind of typical for here. That's just usually how it happens. I think my neighborhood has been clear for a while, and the neighbors across the street still have two giant snowballs in their yard, and everything else is just grass again.
Yeah, my lawn guy messaged me and was like, do you want me to come mow tomorrow? And I was like, I still got snow, man.
Right?
I
It's
mean,
so interesting to see that from that perspective though, because I learned this year that I take the snow for granted. And because I love the snow, I always play out in the snow. My kids play out in the snow. And now we're in a place that gets much less snow. And I'm just like seeing how everyone is reacting as this cold weather moves further south. It's so interesting. I've been seeing the videos of everyone in Louisiana who's seeing snow for the first time in their lives, and they are unhinged in this weather.
dude, Florida got it. The
Oh
beaches
yeah.
of Florida, it was just wild. I mean, it's not, it happens every handful of years these days. Um, that we'll get snow in Houston. But yesterday most people went back to normal activity, but there was still random patches of ice. So there were a lot of wrecks because of the ice.
Oh my goodness.
Like you're driving, it's all fine, everything's dry, and then bam, patch of ice. And
And that
if that's
reminds
not
me.
like the perfect visual for just what we're living through in life in general right now, I don't know what is.
Oh no, I fully understand and am here for that. I'm reminded of a few years ago, Atlanta got they didn't get snow, they got like a half of inch of ice. And this was also me very much taking that for granted because I was watching it on the news and I was like, it's just a half an inch of ice, but their whole infrastructure shut down
Yeah,
because nobody could drive.
yeah, same here. Because I mean, they treated the roads beforehand, but it's not anything that's effective long term. So as soon as the ice settles in, it's no good.
Oh my
Um,
goodness.
so I mean, it's a lot of people kind of get baffled by that, and you're like, we drive in this in Michigan all the time. I'm like, yes, but Michigan also is prepared for this.
Yeah.
That's actually pretty interesting because today we were supposed to talk about withholding at the throat chakra. And when I pulled a card to kind of give me some insight on what direction I needed to take that, I got that lookout. And I used the Akashic Tarot card deck. And the lookout, it's got this picture of this guy up in the crow's nest with his binoculars, like looking out. Um, into the distance while the ship's on fire and there's a battle waging below deck. Um, and, you know, I forgot how I was going to connect those dots between the snow and the card after I started describing.
I mean, it happens. Um,
Um, Hold on. I think I still got the thread. Give me a moment, y'all. That's not the most relatable experience. I don't know what is. Um, it was talking about anticipating the battles ahead and preparing the best that you can and making a plan. Um, oh, there it is. Got it. Okay. And being able to make a plan in order to navigate the future, right? So the difference between the North and the South is the North has it's used to the battle being waged, right?
yes,
It
very much
has
so.
it has acquired the equipment and means to navigate that situation much more easily. And the South, this is like something completely new to us. So we're like, what do we do? What's going on? How do we handle this? And this it's one of those things where the states are kind of like put in this position. Is it worth investing in preparing for these types of situations if it's such a rare occurrence? Is it worth investing our energy and money into
Right.
to upgrade infrastructure, to purchase all of this equipment, to, invest in preparing roadways and other, necessary infrastructure so that these situations are able to be navigated more easily.
Right, right. Well, I'm reminded of last night. I was in a mental wellness support group, which for those of you who struggle with mental health, if you have not looked for a mental health support group, I absolutely recommend it. And one of the big things that was asked in the support group was, how do we navigate all of this divisive difficulty that we're experiencing right now
Mhm.
as a society? Because no matter no matter what, this charged atmosphere has people at each other's throats. People who are not typically at each other's throats. There are people who feel totally unheard, totally invisible, and it's very much part of that not having that foresight. I actually really love the picture that you sent to me of the card, and for anybody who did miss it, the card that she described is it's a ship that's on fire, but it still has the lookout on the high mast looking ahead and seeing. The idea is that we can anticipate and prepare for things. And people were asking how we can show up for ourselves in this. And the first thing that came to my mind was have a plan in place for whatever you need to have done, for whatever you need to move into, and making sure that you are moving towards those next steps, because in such an emotionally charged atmosphere we have this habit of shrinking ourselves and going back into our turtle shells and really just being in this state of panic and fear instead of taking advantage of different tools that we have. But I really liked how you related that to the snow because, unless you know what's ahead and how it's going to look, you can't do that.
Yeah, I mean, like I see it so much metaphorically similar to, the surprise patch of ice. We are in a very slippery time where you might find yourself on sure footing in one moment, and then all of a sudden you're slipping and sliding, and you've got complete and total loss of control.
Right?
Uh, you're at the whim of physics. And being able to take necessary precautions so that you can navigate those situations when they suddenly pop up can be so powerful. Because otherwise, you're stuck in this withholding pattern where you're refusing to give parts of yourself, to share your thoughts. You're holding back and suppressing your emotions and your ideas and your beliefs. And that leads us into such internal states of high stress, and it almost fuels the fire of fear that burns within us, right?
Yeah.
Whereas when we safely explore how to express our emotions, that may be slippery, right? And we're brave enough to have those conversations and broach those topics with other people, it allows us to channel that energy into something that's more beneficial, more authentic, more positive, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're going to be backsliding on that ice, and you're not going to know what's going to happen.
Right. Right. I'm reminded so much in that of like what it looks like when we just kind of like fall into that state of panic.
Hmm.
And we stop making forward motion, and we talk a lot about how interconnected everything is. And I love that you said backsliding on that ice, because I'm just thinking now of like a person driving up a hill and you lose your traction, you fall behind, but you're not only no longer going up the hill and can't get up it, you're running into other people's cars, you're hitting
Hmm.
mailboxes, you're in a yard. And there's sometimes that can have other effects on the internal structure of your car. And that's the same thing that happens to us as people when we find that backslide and we don't try to overcompensate. That's the wrong word. But when we don't try to overcorrect or correct at all, we just allow ourselves to kind of like hit all of those vehicles behind us.
Yeah, it's that moment of panic where you're trying to snatch control.
Yes.
And like I had a near miss last year when I was leaving my subdivision because it was a very busy state highway, and it was under construction for a while, and where they were splitting it so that each direction had its own side and there was a grass median in between. But while it was under construction, it was just a three-ish lane road. Um, where it was like really narrow lanes and there's this sharp curve so that you can't see. And I had these teenagers fly around speeding in this construction zone where there's no visibility. They don't have their headlights on, so you can't see them coming up. So I'm taking necessary precautions. I'm looking both ways. I know that people fly around that curve, so I'm watching as as it's safe for me to cross that lane. And all of a sudden they're right there. And if he would have just tapped the brakes, all I needed was a tap. I would have been out of his way because I was watching. Um,
Right.
but but his inexperience led him to panic, and he yanked his wheel into the lane that I was trying to turn into. So I
Oh,
had, because I'm watching, I'm able to steer around him. So I literally just turn into his lane and kind of weave around him. And I mean, it didn't jerk the car, nothing. I didn't get a scratch on my car, nothing. Insurance was baffled about this. Like, what? Like, my car's perfectly fine though. Like, I'm paying attention and I'm watching and I'm just calmly reacting to what's going on. Well, I should say responding, not reacting. But he yanked his wheel, and as soon as he yanked it into that lane, he panicked again, yanked it back, hit one of the guardrails, and then yanked it again, and went down the ditch to the other side of the lanes that were under construction. And it was that attempt at controlling that situation and that sheer panic that led him to like completely total this beautiful Camaro. And
right.
it's this is a story that I'm telling because this is exactly what we do in life, is we hit this sudden unexpected thing because we're not paying attention, we're not anticipating anything to go wrong or to step into our path. And the moment something does, it startles us and we try to snatch control back and we yank that wheel, you know, and it makes the situation worse.
Oh yeah, and I'm reminded in this of there's a big thing that we talk about in support group about how cutting people off and cutting off relationships. This is just what comes to mind in this particular aspect is lots of times we become so emotionally charged by things that it can be very, very difficult to see other perspectives. It can be really difficult to withhold bias. And oftentimes, and I'm not necessarily talking about like politically or anything like that at this point in time, which I know that that does fit in with a lot of the things that are happening, especially here in the US right now. But the last resort should be cutting people off. That is your last resort because that is an extreme. Am I against it? Absolutely not. I think that if you need this to happen, and especially if this is a person who is part of your family, a person who you grew up with, a person who you maybe were inseparable with for a very, very long time, uh, cutting them off should be the very last resort, and it should be out of absolute necessity, not because you are in an emotionally charged space. And that doesn't mean that you can't take the time to explore those emotional reactions, or even take some time separated from that person so that way both of you can get your bearings and come back with a little less of that emotional charge. But that's where we see that difference between making those calm, calculated moves and removing that charge from what we're doing versus your knee-jerk reaction of, okay, well, now I'm going to totally destroy this whole section of my family. Not saying that it's necessarily your fault, but just to think about this for a second. When we expand our minds and we go into an objective viewpoint, we can see that those things make a rift between not only us but other people, and there's so much happening there that we need to take accountability for. And when you make those knee-jerk reactions, that rift becomes much deeper and sometimes much more permanent and is very difficult to walk back from should you realize that maybe you made a mistake, maybe you crashed your car and your insurance is going to raise your rates. You never know. But it's such a large decision to make.
Absolutely. You know, one of the things that has helped me a lot is when I'm navigating those situations that kind of catch me off guard is to just first like express the emotion, name it, right? Like, so in conversation, I'm like, that made me feel very angry. And then in that conversation, following that statement, I start to explore why while I'm in that conversation with them so that it can start to generate a discussion, right? Because if we don't actually like acknowledge that feeling, if we're suppressing it, we're withholding it, it gets very pent up. And it's going to cause that knee jerk reaction where, you know, all of a sudden the pressure in the bottle is too much and it's going to explode.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I like that. I like the way you said that. And this being such an important space, when we give names to what we're experiencing, we have a deeper understanding of them. I recently had a conversation with someone who said that they disliked using the word disorder for several aspects of mental wellness and mental health. And they were like, I see it as like a neurological difference. And I understand that because I often my son has autism and ADHD. Most of you know that at this point, I think. And he doesn't really have like special needs. And so I have changed that verbiage and I say that he has extra needs because he does. He needs extra tools, he needs extra time. The word extra need fits him and it fits him more than special needs does. But when we look at words like disorder and we start taking away that word from what a person is experiencing and we say, okay, well, they're just different, you're actually taking away that availability for them to have access to tools, for them to understand that this is a normative that they can follow for themselves. Does it look like everybody else? No. But we need that power in that word to set that tone. And emotions work the same way.
Absolutely. It's like I was talking about, I think I was talking to my sister, but like human nature, we want to bounce from one extreme side to the other polarized extreme side. And then we realize that that didn't work. We don't like that. And so we'll bounce back to where we started, but it'll be a little less, right? And and then that's not quite it. So we'll flip back to the other side, but it'll be a little less. And just over time, we kind of start to find that middle. And, we do this as humans, but we also do it as society too. And so, having these specific labels and emphasis on different things, is almost like that polar side of the spectrum where you're bringing the awareness that needs to be brought to it so that we can start to find that middle ground where everything's integrated and balanced.
Yes. I love those words. Thank you for words.
I,
uh,
I had to stop and think about it for a moment. I was like, I don't want to put my foot in my mouth and explain this wrong.
right? Well, and especially when we're saying that, the words that we're using give us that identification and help us to navigate things. And I think that's a strong word for this, especially with lookout and withholding being like the two major ideas that we start with. Navigation is so important in the way that we show up for these things that are happening inside of us. And that language helps us do that.
Absolutely. But, when it comes to navigation also involves communication. We have to be able to share these concepts and ideas within ourselves with others and expect that there's going to be some bumps in the road.
Yes. I've noticed that a lot, especially talking about withholding the lack of communication. Um, I know we talked last week about lots about how sometimes people make themselves small,
Mhm.
and that is part of that knee-jerk reaction also is we start withholding like in the opposite sense, in that negative sense of not putting ourselves out there instead of withholding judgment and withholding bias and withholding um those knee-jerk reactions. It's a way that we can see that, okay, maybe I do need to open myself up a little bit. There should always be a difference in you and the people around you. And I'm also reminded of what you said about how, the communication, taking the time in order to see both sides of the story and have that neutral understanding. Um, when we pull ourselves in and make ourselves too small, we are incapable of doing that.
Yeah, well, okay, so maybe this is semantics, but I want to kind of like caveat on the idea of withholding judgment and withholding bias. Because I think that it's more beneficial to name it instead, acknowledge it and say it out loud, right? Like, yeah, I have some judgments, I have some reservations about these things, and I'm acknowledging that I have a bias about this stuff, right? And that allows other people to kind of like hold accountability as you explore these new ideas versus withholding it allows it to kind of like be that spooky shadow in the corner.
I like that. I like that. That is definitely more along the lines of like what what my brain is seeing versus what I said. So thank you for that.
It's okay. And like I said, I figured it was probably very similar to what you were intending, which is why I was like, it might just be semantics, you know? But I think that's an important point, is just like, especially in such a polarizing time, it can be so beneficial for us to just name those judgments, name those biases. And then when you name them and you acknowledge them out loud, you're able to recognize that judgments are your own personal preferences, you know, and set those aside. And your biases are directly correlated to your own personal experiences and what you've moved through. And once you've acknowledged that, you can set it aside so that you can actually explore something that's different than what you know.
I like that. And in taking that, if as a person approaches that and can activate that in their life, how do you see a person moving through that? How do you see them, maybe not so much as transmuting that energy, but that is also a possibility. How do you see it showing up, um, for someone in the experiences that we're kind of like looking, I'm saying looking at right now as more of an example, but how do you see someone moving through that?
I mean, when it comes to having those hard conversations, it can be really helpful to set those ground rules and acknowledge your bias out loud, acknowledge your preconceived notions and judgments around something so that you can have someone help you set those aside and show you where it might be interfering with your thought process when you're trying to explore something new and different, right? So if we're having a discussion and we're standing on two different sides of the line, when you lay out your own biases, right, you're setting down that baggage, and it just kind of lets you have that conversation and show where each person truly stands so that you can get through to the core intention of I see you and you see me, and allow it to be that way. Like in science, scientists often have to look at and explore and then acknowledge their own biases before they can proceed with conducting an experiment. Otherwise, it can skew their interpretation of the results.
Yeah.
So, when it comes to, in real life, say it out loud while you are before you have that conversation. Say it out loud. Invite the other person to lay their bias and judgments and preconceived notions out too, so that way you can hold each other accountable to have that hard conversation. I think you and I were talking about it the other day, like going back to how philosophy is taught to discuss things, where you're defining the terms, you're setting the standards of this means this, right? And you're laying it out. And approaching these hard conversations from that stance where you're just exploring these thoughts and ideas. You don't have to take it in. I think I used the metaphor with you, like I can look at the skunk through the window and examine it. I don't have to open my door and invite it in so that I
Yes.
can take a closer look and figure out
Yes.
that the cat is that the cat that what I thought was a cat is actually a skunk. And that's a reference to last week's podcast, by the way.
Yes, which yeah, that is an interesting example, but that it makes it have so much more clarity. And as we're talking about, giving things names, saying it out loud, identifying it, and coming together with bias, but to see the other side and to understand the bias of the other side of things, I'm reminded of, this is so simple. I'm currently taking a perspectives into natural sciences class, and we talked actually yesterday about the different ideas of how emotions play into the way that we do scientific research. And in what you were just saying, I'm reminded so much in the ways of how they talked about when you have the preconceived notions and when you move only with preconceived notions in the ideas of research and experiment, you can't work from that objective view. You're so far into the subjective that you're going to find the answer you want to find because you're looking at it from the perspective of, well, I know this to be true. I know this to be right. I'm also reminded so much of there was something I watched with Neil deGrasse Tyson, and he was talking about how utilizing Google is the ultimate experiment in confirmation bias because no matter what you put into Google, there is an answer that fits exactly what you think it is in that search engine. You will
Confirmation bias. Absolutely.
Yep. And they're behind that though, we were talking about how when we're looking at okay, well, how could this be disproven when we go through and we look at the other side of it instead of expecting this particular outcome, this particular idea, and we can see all the other sides of it is when we can truly get to the bottom of something. And this is like, it's almost like emotional science the way you're explaining it.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's this book called I Think Therefore I'm Wrong by Howard Rankin. Um, it's got the subtitles of A Guide to Bias, Political Correctness, and Fake News, but I really loved how he uses these very relatable real world scenarios to help you see how bias and defense mechanisms look in real life, so that you can really identify them and work through them. There's also some like powerful questions at the end of each chapter too, to kind of help you reflect and look back at it. And it explains some of like the of perception, right? And how perception happens and what influences perception. So, if that's something that you really struggle with is acknowledging or even becoming aware of that bias, you know, check it out. It's a great place to kind of start exploring some of these ideas, but also, cultivate safe circles where people feel comfortable and safe enough to call out your biases, to point it out to you so that you can, check it and set it aside so that you can keep an eye on it while you explore something different.
I think that that's something that we see missing a lot in several communities is that accountability and showing up when someone does something that maybe needs to be questioned, um, or that maybe needs to have that pushback. I'm reminded to you constantly saying poke the bear last episode.
Yeah.
And it's like a continuation of that because now you're in this like you've put yourself in community, you've put yourself into these emotional relationships, and there are still some times where it comes up and you still need to poke that bear and say, "Hey, what you doing, buddy?"
Mm-hmm. And then you can go give it a hug and cuddle the bear, right? Like you got to set that intention and that baseline foundation of I love you, I accept you, I appreciate you, I value you, and here is something that you need to be aware of. And I mean, we as a society really suck at receiving feedback. We feel like it is an insult, right? And we fear failure. But like me, I'm like, give me all the feedback. I don't care if it's harsh, as long as you tell me what it is that you think needs to change. I can work with that, Like give me all the feedback. Please poke me and be like,
Oh
hey,
yeah,
what are you doing? Because if I don't know that it's a thing, then I'm never going to know it's a thing. It is
exactly.
completely unconscious. It is behind me. I don't know that there is a giant tarantula crawling up my back, y'all. You gotta tell me.
Right. And I'm reminded a lot in that right there of how I have this running experiment in my brain. And as I look at society, I look for the different big air quotes here, ideas of archetypes, because there's no like set idea of archetypes. There's archetypes for everything. You can find it in Carl Jung's work, you can find it in just witchy work, you can find it in different decks. There you can use anything for an archetype. But when I look at what the idea of these shadow work archetypes and trauma archetypes are, and I'm looking at society, the one I see the most is the victim archetype.
Mm-hmm.
And the what I see that contributes to that mindset the most is that we are afraid to say what we need to say to show up for ourselves and say, "Hey, you hurt me. You did this. We need to have a conversation about this."
Absolutely. I was thinking about this the other day. When we talk about creating a safe space for others, that starts with creating a safe space for ourselves where we're able to walk into a room full of opposing viewpoints and feel safe within ourselves of expressing our thoughts, our ideas, and interacting with these people in a manner that allows us to explore one another and those differences to take what we thought was a square because we've been staring at it dead on and turn it and look at it from a different side and realize that maybe we're looking at a cube and we've just been so stuck in this one perspective that we thought it was a 2D object when it's really a very dynamic thing.
Oh, yes. I also just like, as you said that, I took a square and I turned it and I was like, well, crap, it's also a diamond.
Exactly.
It can be
Exactly.
so many different things.
And it just depends on where you're standing as to what you see. So if you are in that space where you feel safe enough within yourself, right, to explore these different vantage points from others that you do not have and have not experienced, it gives you this ability, like we were talking about last week with provocation to liberation. It liberates your mind. It gives you this ability to discover new things, new ways of being, new ways of living, right? New ways of thinking, and it just
Oh,
experiencing
yeah.
life. And that is so freaking powerful. But you have to feel safe in facing things that are opposing. You cannot go into a withholding pattern.
Yes. And I'm very much reminded of how different communities are, when we have these large, drastic, opposing events. I don't really know what else to use to describe it, but it's those opposing viewpoints amongst something that maybe you're in a community and you expected that there was an alignment. And I use that word expected also with big quotations because we talk a lot about how expectations often result in disappointment because everyone is so vastly different. We can have similar thoughts about 100 things, but two things outside of that 100 you may totally disagree on. And that doesn't mean that there's all of these other changes within that person. It's just something you need to kind of like come to that conclusion of, okay, well, we're different. We're unique. We have opposing viewpoints. We have different experiences that are going on in our lives, and it's healthy for people to have those different subjective viewpoints. If everyone was just like you and everything that you believe in and put your foot down in and move forward with, life would be very, very boring.
I say that all the time. Like, the, it is the diversity And the differences that give the contrast and beauty to life, it's what gives life color. Diversity does not have to be divisive.
Exactly. It really does not have to be divisive. And I implore everyone to take a look at it and understand what the difference is between having diversity versus being divisive. Um, because there is a lot, and I'm not necessarily saying, let me walk those two words back. I am not saying that you need to go out and align with something that is harmful or morally or ethically unjust. But you have family members, friends, neighbors, people who you may not be listening to that maybe you just need to hear out with a more open mind and see where they're at, see what they're going through, and understand that they have these differing viewpoints. And allow that diversity in because we can do that. We can be accepting of that.
So one of the things that I usually try to do is I go in with the assumption that everybody is always doing the best that they can with the resources that they have in that moment, right? Nobody's intention is to be harmful and hurt others. And even still, if that is their intention, it's because they are hurting, right? And they are doing the best that they can with what they were taught based off of their experience, right? So that is my caveat. That's my starting point. And then when I hear something that is just wildly out there, I ask questions. I want to know why.
Yeah,
I want to know how we got there. What's your level of thinking? What is your reasoning behind that? Where do you want that idea to go? Right? Because when we are able to explore that, you might figure out that you have the same shared value, the same shared goal. It's just based off of your experiences and what you have lived through and been taught and seen. You have a different approach of how to get there.
exactly. Exactly.
And when we can come together and examine those two different methods of how we get there, it can open up completely new approaches, right? That may be even better than the existing ones.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think that is one of the most important things, and that goes back to the idea of like experimentation and getting answers to moving forward. I'm also reminded so much about how, uh, and this, the only thing I can think of is there's so much right now, and this is part of our charged environment also, but there's so much about education and intelligence kind of being thrown around right now. And I want to remind everyone who is listening, if that is part of your experience, that there is a known lack of structure in many educational systems across the world. And because of that, people have different ideas, they have different experiences, and they learn different things. And that also is the same for those of us who go into different areas of study and thought as we go through like the collegiate level of things. You may have somebody that goes into business, somebody that goes into philosophy, somebody that goes into political science. All three of those people are going to look at the world through drastically different lenses. All three of them are important lenses for us to put together and be able to work with in order to see the full spectrum of what living as a conscious social structure looks like.
It kind of reminds me of the medical system. You, you
Yes.
don't you don't want a cardiologist doing brain surgery.
Nope, your brain will be gone.
But to have the whole idea of how every single piece of the human body works, you need each specialty to come to the table and have that conversation to figure out what's really going on and what's happening within the body and how it impacts all these different things.
Yes. Yes, very, very much so. We are coming up on our hour. If there's one big takeaway from this, what would you say English, what would you say that is?
I would challenge everyone to bridge the gap. If we keep staying on opposite sides of the line, the divide just grows further. So be curious, don't withhold. Be curious, ask questions, and start laying your bias and your judgments out on the line and having others help you stay accountable because that bias works both ways, right? So
Yeah.
that you can have those hard conversations and start to step towards each other.
I love that. I think that is the perfect thing for people to take away from this. If anybody does have any questions, any comments, any concerns, please feel free to reach out to us, especially in this incredibly charged atmosphere that we have. You can comment on the Facebook. You can make comments within the YouTube video. You can also send us an email. We're still working on getting an email directly for the podcast, but you can email goddesslifecounseling@gmail.com with any questions, comments, or concerns, and we can talk through it and see where maybe we can be of some assistance. And I know we are going to come back in about 30 minutes and sit down at round table with Lane. Is there anything else you wanted to share before we hop off?
Yeah, on the whole comments and concerns. If you're gonna tell me I suck, you got to tell me why, okay? That I need the useful feedback.
Yes, yes, we expect the feedback to be useful, friends. And it's okay if you tell us that you don't like us or you suck. We want to hear your opinions. We want to be there. We want to show up authentically for our community. So please tell us what you're feeling. And thank you for listening. Thank you, Ashley, for sitting down with me and helping us walk through this idea of not having knee-jerk reactions and being able to cross that divide. And we'll be back very shortly, friends.